Hello and welcome to episode 20 of the Insider's Guide to Project Cars 2, where today we are going to be taking a look at the actual creation of a tuning setup and basically testing and making adjustment as you go through a testing session. Now, the actual process of creating a setup may differ slightly depending on what it is that you're actually creating the setup for, whether it's a career race, a multiplayer race, whether you're doing an actual organized league or community race, or whether you're doing time trial or a community event. In this instance, I'm going to be preparing a race setup for the next AOR league race that I participate in. It's in the GT3 class, and I drive the BMW M6 GT3 in the league. And this next race that we're going to be at is Long Beach. Now, I've loaded up the settings that we're going to be running in that race. The date is set to the 12th of August. The start time of the race in game is set to 8 PM, and we use 2 times time acceleration. So when it actually comes to the end of the race, it'll be 10 o'clock at night in game time. The race itself actually goes on for an hour. So I'll be creating a setup basically based off of those settings that will work in those settings. Obviously with time trial it's going to be very, very different. You're kind of more looking for pure outright speed and the conditions that time trial is fixed to. Obviously with career races you may want to actually double check the actual settings of the career race, jump back out, and then actually go about working on the setup. And that's basically what I'm doing here in this instance. We already know, or I already know, as well as all the other guys who are competing in the league, we already know what the settings are going to be for this race, which allows us to practice basically specifically for those settings. Now, as you can see up in the top here, the track temperature is 35 degrees C. I did go and load up the session at basically 10 PM in-game time, so when the race actually finishes, and it was 34 degrees C track temperature. So the track temperature doesn't really change, and that's basically eliminated one thing off the list of stuff to actually test and decide what I'm going to be doing in terms of setup, and that is the actual tyre choice. It's going to be too hot for the soft tyres, despite it being a night race, so it's going to be the hard tyres that I'm going to be running with. But there's plenty of other things that I need to figure out. I need to figure out basically the brakes, the tyre temperatures, although there's not really too much I can do about those, but obviously the tyre pressures, downforce that I'm going to be running, suspension, dampers, differential, and a couple of other things. Now, for this first part, we're going to start off with the baseline setup that we had created previously. Basically for that, all I did is load up the stable setup and then made a couple of changes that I make on pretty much all the tracks that I come to on this car. Basically made a couple of changes, so I'll quickly run through those. All the tyre stuff is default, so is the brake pressure. Brake balance was dropped from 60-40 down to 58-42. Front brake duct opening is default. We've lowered the rear brake duct opening down to 60%. Front downforce is at the default of 0. Rear downforce is at the default of 6. I'm actually going to drop that down to 5 as well. And then the longitudinal weight bias was shifted rearwards by 1 click to 49.51 from the default. All the suspension stuff is still default. We haven't touched those yet. All the actual damper stuff is default as well. I've taken out all the bump stop, as you can see here, which is what I did with the baseline setup. When it comes to the engine ECU gearing, boost pressure, air restrictor and radiator opening are all default. Engine braking I've upped from 1 to 4. Generally it's just a little bit more stable. The gear ratios I can't touch. Traction control slip I've upped from 10% up to 15%. I'll keep it at 15% for now. Actually, no, I'll up that to 20%. It's a setting that I've kind of settled on a little bit more recently with these league races. And the other change that I made is putting 90 litres of fuel in for basically getting a baseline of a race setup. I generally tend to find that where our races are an hour long, depending on the track, we need somewhere between a region of 85 to 105 litres of fuel. So 90 is a pretty good test bed starting place to test with. Obviously, when it actually comes to the race, I'll figure out how much fuel I'm going to actually need for that hour, and I'll go ahead and actually put it into the race setup. And then the last thing that we changed on the differential page was the preload. We've dropped it down to 80% from 90. So I'm going to very quickly save this under Long Beach. So LB AOR, we're in season 9, just so I know in the future when I actually come back to looking and potentially loading up this setup again, I know roughly when the setup was actually created. H for the hard tyres, and then version 1 of the setup. So we're going to save that, and we are going to go out on track, start driving around, and actually get some baseline times set in the session. So just trying to generate a little bit of heat into the brakes. At the moment I've shifted the brake bias rearwards, as you can see. Just moved it back just so I can get a little bit more heat into the rear brakes as well. And then obviously the first couple of laps, it's all about getting the tyres and brakes actually up to temperature, because they start off staying cold. And then essentially what I'm going to be doing for this first part is run somewhere between the region of 5 to 10 laps, and what I'm going to be looking to do is basically get an idea as to the changes that I'm going to need to make for temperature and pressure based stuff. So we'll be looking at the tyre temperatures, the brake temperatures, seeing if we can make any changes with regards to the brake duct openings, as closing those up will give us a little bit more speed, but obviously need to make sure that the brakes are within their operating window and actually stay there, and I'm not actually overheating the brakes either. And then obviously want to check the tyre pressures, so I want those to be basically as close to each other on all four corners of the car as they possibly can be. And then the last thing that we can check in terms of temperature is the oil temperature, and then that will give us an idea as to how open we can run the radiator opening. Obviously closing that up will give us a little bit more straight line speed, but obviously where this is a street circuit and the walls are very, very close, there's no margin for error. I may have to leave it open a little bit, just so I've got a little bit of a safety net, just in case I do have a tap with another car, or I do go and clonk the wall somewhere along the line. I've got a little bit of a safety margin, and hopefully that will be enough to prevent me from having to make a pit stop. So this first lap, or this first flying lap, is pretty much a write-off. All the tyres and brakes are still coming up to temperature and up to pressure, so it's not going to be a quick one. But where this is an hour-long league race, basically what I'm aiming for is obviously good performance in terms of lap time, but also want something that's quite stable and is confidence inspiring. As one thing that I really don't like is when you've got a reasonably quick car, but the other cars that are around you are just that little bit faster, yet you feel like you're pretty much on the ragged edge of what the car and the setup is actually able to do, and you can't push it any further. I hate that feeling. I feel absolutely hopeless, and it makes you nervous. You can't push, and it's just not a fun time. So having something that is stable and inspires confidence, and I can do consistent good lap times with that confidence inspiring drivability, it will allow me to push a little bit more when I actually need to get that extra little bit of performance out of the car. As driving on the ragged edge, having to save the car 4 or 5 times over the course of a lap is, sure, it may be fast, but over the course of an hour it does get very tiring, and the chance of you having contact with another car or having a contact with the wall is going to be quite high. So there's the first reasonable sort of lap time. A relatively low 120. Obviously that came when the brakes and tyres were a bit more up to temperature. The very first flying lap that I did, the tyres were still down in the 50 odd degrees sort of region. Now you can see they're kind of up around 80 to 70 odd. It's just that front left which will get some heat coming through this corner here. It's down in the 60s, it's now gone up to 70. And looking up in the top right, you can see up there our brake temperatures as well. They're kind of coming up and heating up in the core there. So obviously, as all these are coming in quite nicely up into normal operating windows, the performance and the lap times are starting to drop, and we're starting to get quicker and a bit more representative as to where our baseline setup is already. So this is basically what I'm trying to establish in these first 5 to 10 laps or so, is get an idea as to how the car generally handles around the track. Try and get all the stuff that is kind of temperature dependent out the way first. So I want to get the radiator opening, the brake ducts and the tyre pressures all established relatively quickly, because then that way I don't really have to worry about adjusting those. Tyre pressures I may have to adjust, as obviously making adjustments to the diff, the suspension, the dampers, camber, things like that are all going to have an effect as to how the tyres are actually used over the course of the lap, and that could potentially affect the actual tyre pressures themselves. But the sooner I can get those things kind of sorted and settled, the less I have to worry about those. Because what I don't want to be doing is go and start fiddling with the diff and the suspension, whilst also trying to fiddle around with tyre pressures and things like that, because what I could end up finding is that once I've actually got the tyre pressures to where I want them to be, I could have a very different handling car than what I was expecting. So one of the things before I actually started recording is actually started doing some laps around Long Beach, just so I'm familiar with the circuit. Generally, what I tend to find is with a setup, I'm able to gain probably a second or so, second to a second and a half, maybe even 2 seconds. It kind of depends on the actual track itself. Worth of lap time over the default setups, and then basically once I've got a setup, it's all about driving that setup, getting used to it, getting those consistent lap times in, getting good consistent knowledge of the track and picking up that flow and rhythm, and with that comes even more lap time as well. So generally from the very first stages of starting testing through to basically when I go into the race, gain somewhere between the region of 2 to 3 seconds. And all that comes in somewhere between the region of 4 to 10 hours worth of practice. That's what I tend to do for each league race, and that's just to be mildly competitive. I'm not there up at the front. There's some very, very fast guys in our league. I don't know how much time they actually put into their practice. Generally, I'm kind of somewhere between a couple of attempts to half a second a lap off of the very fastest front running guys. So you can imagine how much practice I would need to put in to actually be up there and competitive with them, but they're also in a different car as well. Obviously I drive the BMW M6 GT3. It's a GT3 class race, and you can use any GT3 car within the class for the entire season, the calendar length. You can change car halfway through, but you lose your points that you had gathered over the course of the season up to that point in doing so. So I picked the BMW at the start of the season as I quite like the car. I'm very comfortable with it. Others have chosen the Ferrari. We've got plenty of Audis. There's a couple of other BMWs. There's a Ginetta. There's actually a couple of BMWs F.O.O.Ls, a few Porsches, and there's also a couple of Nissan GTRs as well in the league. So there's a reasonable mix. I own also the Lamborghini. So there's a reasonable mix of various different cars, both turbo and naturally aspirated. Here's a good, very good competitive league. And as you can probably tell, I've got the track IR on as well, which is why if you ever hear a clonking sound coming through the mic audio, that'll be the cable on the track IR on the Track Clip Pro that's attached to my headset, knocking against the headset and the mic I have on the attachment, so it picks it up there. So 7 laps in, mid to low, or should I say mid to high 118s at the moment, which is pretty solid. Just taking a look at the tyre pressures. Also clunked the wall there. I do have damage and mechanical damage actually turned off, so obviously if I do make contact with the wall, I can continue on, won't pick up any damage from it, and I don't have to worry about starting again on a test stint. So looking at these tyre pressures, it looks like we need to go 0.03 bar lower on the front left. Front right, we can go down basically a click, and you go 0.07 down on the rear left, then 0.05 down on the rear right. I've just gone and invalidated my lap, but this is practice, so it doesn't really matter. So getting an idea of the tyre pressures now that they're kind of in and around their stable sort of pressures at the moment. Brake temperatures look to be pretty good in terms of their minimum temperatures around 300 degrees on the front. Heavy braking zone, it gets up to 650, 660 odd on the front, so they are pretty much spot on in terms of temperature. For those, I'm not really going to be able to touch and adjust those in this case, which is a bit of a shame, because closing those up would give us a bit more straight line performance, and obviously with that comes better lap times. But I don't want to close those up because that's going to have an effect on tyre pressures, and it's also going to reduce braking performance, because generally the brakes are actually feeling quite good around here, as the temperature suggests. They're in and around their operating windows. And taking a look down on the bottom right in the speedometer display, we can see the engine temperature down there it was 98 degrees on the straight. It's down at 94, 93 in the corners. So as we accelerate here, temperature's going to increase. 7, 98. So I can't really touch that. I'm not going to be able to adjust the radiator opening. That's basically pretty much where I want it. And if anything, you could probably do with opening up a little bit, just so I've got that safety net if I do make contact with the wall or with someone in the race. I've got that little bit buffer before I go up to basically an operating temperature that is going to potentially lead to an engine blowout. So now that we've got a pretty good idea of those, let's jump back to the pits and let's make the changes to the tyre pressures. So need to turn symmetrical adjustment off here. So it was 0.3 front left. We'll leave it at 1.40 bar on the front right. We need to go 7 down on the rear left and then 5 down on the rear right. And generally that should now give us 1.80 bar pretty much all around. What I'm actually going to do is knock it down one more click all the way around, and what that will give us is around about 1.78, 1.79 all around the circuit. That'll give us a tiny little bit more grip through the corners. Now, one thing that I would definitely advise when it comes to doing your own testing is actually making changes and then, or doing like one set of changes, so doing like just tire pressures, doing it, saving it, and creating a new save slot for it. So in this case version 2, and basically make one change at a time. So in this case, just do tire pressures, or just do brake ducts, or just do downforce, or just adjust the spring rates, or just adjust the anti-roll bars. Make those individual changes rather than doing them in a relatively big group. In this case, where I kind of know what I'm doing, and also where I'm actually trying not to make this episode too long, I'm going to just start making basically bulk adjustments and doing those. So one thing I'm going to do here is drop the power ramp down to 55 degrees. That should give us a little bit better traction coming off the corners. So I'm actually going to go ahead and save that to version 2 as well. But saving it with different versions basically means that if you go and make one change, such as just adjusting the spring rates, and then you didn't like that change, you can always revert back to what you had previously and basically undo those changes that you make. If you do them on an individual basis like that, you'll get a better understanding of what those changes that you actually made are doing to the car, and it's easier to go back and undo those changes. So now what I'm going to do is basically go out again for another 5 to 6 laps, just double check the tyre pressures and also that diff change, make sure it's all good there, and I'm basically in and around the target tyre pressures that I want. And then after that I'll actually start looking at the aerodynamics of the car, see what we should do in terms of the actual aero setup for this circuit, because at the moment I've got 0 wing on the front and I've got 5 wing on the rear. That would give me relatively good straight line performance, but not so much in the corners. But where Long Beach is quite tight and twisty in some ways, there's basically a lot of slow speed corners. There's a couple of medium speed corners. There's not really anywhere apart from turn 1 and maybe the entrance to 1 or 2 other corners where actually running a lot of aero is going to benefit the car. So finding the actual right aero balance is going to be interesting, whether it's going to be best to run basically max downforce on the front, or whether it's best to just go with one wing. I don't think 0 wing is going to be too great for Long Beach. The only place that is going to be really beneficial is actually on the start finish straight, and then into the braking zone of turn 1, as the basically that braking zone in turn 1 is the best overtaking opportunity on the circuit. So that's something that I need to think about there. But obviously if I'm tucked up behind another car, I'm going to be in the slipstream. I'm not going to have as much drag, so having that higher downforce isn't going to be too much of an issue. So let's switch it back to the full HUD. Again, as the temperatures in both the brakes and the tyres are starting to build, this first lap is going to be pretty much a write-off. It's not going to be representative of anything. This lap might be a little bit more representative, but generally I'm not going to see too much more of an improvement until the tyres actually come more up to their optimal pressures and kind of stabilise at a much more equal range on all four corners of the car. Because at the moment they're still varying a little bit, but they'll come to meet at basically the same point of hopefully 1.78, 1.79 on all four corners. So we'll double check on those in probably another 4 or 5 laps time once it's stabilised a little bit more. Got the brake bias up to where I want it on default, because the brake bias will actually affect how your tyre pressures change as the heat that you build in the brakes radiates off into the rim of the tyre, which then transfers into the tyre carcass and then affects the tyre pressure. So that's actually one of the disadvantages of having the of lowering brake ducts without changing the tyre pressures, is closing the brake ducts off. They get hotter, so more heat actually gets transferred into the rim of the tyre, which then goes into the carcass and increases the pressure possibly further than you actually want them to. So if you do make changes, especially closing your brake ducts, do double check that your tyre pressures are still where you want them. Otherwise you may find that they will be under or over inflated depending on the change that you actually make with your brake ducts. Obviously if you open up the brake ducts, your tyre pressures may be under what you actually want them to be, because there won't be as much heat radiating off the brakes, because they'll be getting cooled a lot more going down the straights. Whereas obviously closing them up, obviously depending on the circuit, if the circuit's not too heavy on brakes and there's some quite nice long straights and the conditions are generally quite cool, you can close up the brake ducts a bit more to try and maintain that heat. But in this case, the brake temperatures are basically bang on where I need them at the moment, so I can't really adjust them and close them. Otherwise I'm going to start overheating the brakes, I'll get brake fade and I'll lose that braking performance, but also I could end up ballooning the tyres as well with the tyre pressures. So things to think about. Generally, the car is actually feeling really quite good. That was me taking out a cone there, that was on contact with the wall. Tyre pressures are still rising, I haven't settled yet. So probably what I'll do is actually cut out this next section, just show you the lap times that I got towards the end, so you can see how those last couple of changes have affected the lap times, if at all, and then also show you the tyre pressures as well once they basically come up to a stable temperature. So I'll cut this bit out and we'll jump a couple of laps ahead in time. So there we go then, that's a low 118.1 as you can see. So already the car's feeling good, we're getting good lap times out of it. And the tyre pressures should be pretty much stable now. So once we come out of these sequence of turns and get off the wall there on the outside, we'll take a look at the tyre pressures. And they are in and around the right area-ish. They're not too bad. Possibly do a slight small adjustment to those. Obviously, where I'm a little bit further into the session, the sun has actually disappeared a little bit further down behind the horizon, so the temperatures were changing a little bit around the track, and that will obviously have an effect in terms of tyre pressure as well. So that's the difference there, but generally the car feels really quite good and really quite fast. This lap has been pretty naff, back up to a 19, so a low 1 minute 18 is our fastest lap so far. So let's go back to the pit box and actually make a whole bunch of changes now. And like I said before, generally I don't advise actually doing this. This is purely for the sake of trying to basically speed up the actual process of creating a setup for myself, and obviously have a little bit more of a better understanding and a good idea as to actually where I want to go in terms of actually creating a setup. It's a lot safer to actually make single changes by themselves, save those in incremental setup slots, and basically test your changes before going on and moving on to the next thing. So the thing that I'm going to do here is adjust the downforce, put that up to, we're going to put that up to 2 for now, to see how that works. Rear downforce I'm going to leave at 5. There isn't any really high speed corners where a lot of rear downforce is actually going to be required. So generally what I tend to do is, if I run 0 downforce, I'm run somewhere between the region of 2 to 5 on the rear. If I'm running front downforce of 1, I generally run between 4 to 6 and then on the rear, and then with 2 is generally between 5 and the maximum of 8. But where I don't really need too much rear downforce for this track, hopefully, I'm going to run a value of 5 for now. I'll leave the longitudinal weight bias where it is. Now, towing angle, I'm going to put that to minus 0.2. That will give us a little bit more turn-in power. Anti-roll bars, I'm going to drop 1 click all round. And I'm actually going to soften the spring rates 1 click on the front and rear as well. So what I mean by the incremental doing individual changes, what I should have done in this case is basically just made the downforce changes, saved it, gone out, tested those, see how it works, then come back if I'm happy, go and make, say, just the spring rate changes or just the anti-roll bar changes, save it, go out, test those, come back, and then make the other change of either the spring rate or anti-roll bar, whichever way you go about changing it. In this case, obviously, when I'm trying to do things a little bit quicker, I'm doing them more in bulk. Nothing I'm going to change here. The engine braking, it feels quite good at the moment, being in and around 4. Generally I don't like it going too low. You can get more lap time performance and faster lap times running at a lower value. However, the car does feel safer running up at a higher value. Usually I run a value of 5 or 6, but here, where I'm not shifting down into second and first gear quite so heavily, it feels quite good at 4. I'm quite happy with those. Dampers I'm going to leave for the moment. I'm just going to make those changes and save this to a new setup slot, call it V3, and we'll go out and test these changes, see if we can break down into the 1 minute 17s, see if we get a little bit more lap time performance out of these. Where I've made basically the same changes front and rear, it shouldn't really affect the balance too much. The only thing where there could be quite a big balance shift is in terms of aerodynamics, where I've now got 2 wing on the front. That'll give me a lot more turning power along with that negative toe in. That'll make the car sharper and more responsive in terms of turning into the corner, but I haven't changed that rear wing. But hopefully I shouldn't need to change it now. This is one of the things I want to keep in mind in terms of the downforce, whether 2 is going to be too high and doesn't really provide too much benefit, or whether it'd be beneficial of dropping back down to a front wing of 1 and possibly a 4 or 5 on the rear, or if actually running no downforce on the front is going to be beneficial, although I can't really see that happening here at Long Beach because there isn't really too much anywhere where you get a lot of straight line performance, and it is more about cornering performance, but it's a lot of slow speed corners where aero isn't going to be hugely effective. So let's bring the brake bias back up to its where I usually have it, of 58. This first lap, obviously temperatures are still coming up, so this first lap isn't going to be overly representative, so there's no real point in pushing really hard. So let's just bring the tyres and brakes up to temperature on this one. Not really doing too much weaving. You can do some weaving to obviously help bring the temperatures up a little bit quicker, but obviously in doing so you don't want to do it too aggressively, so that you want to basically avoid sliding the car over the surface of the track. Basically bring gentle progressive heat into the tyres, because otherwise you just end up taking the nice grippy layer that you get at the very start of a brand new tyre, taking that away, and when you do get your tyres and brakes up to actual temperature, you're not going to quite have that grip that you have with a brand new set. So this lap is not going to be representative, as you can see, and we should be able to push a little bit more on this one, although I'm a little bit wary that the front tyres are still a little bit cold. So let's see how we do over the next few laps. See if there's any improvements to the car in terms of lap time and in terms to its feel and stability. I mean, the BMW I like how it drives pretty much straight out of the box anyway, so there's not really too much that I change drastically from it in terms of trying to find performance, because I'm more after that comfortable feeling where I can get the confidence from the car and push through that. Because a confident driver is a fast driver. There's no point being scared of the car, because otherwise you're not going to be able to push it. So that lap time is a little bit slower, high 18. There's that better turn in. Script of the wall, a little bit deep there coming through the second part of the fountain, which isn't ideal. One of the things that I haven't done yet is actually adjust the dampers and actually bring those into work with the suspension. That's probably one of the last things, or the next thing that I'm going to change. A bit of oversteer there with that bump in the mid corner. I can unsettle the car. The dampers will help solve that. So I probably should have changed them here in the last bulk of changes that I just made. We are very, very close to our previous best. 10th and a half. The car's feeling good though. Feels pretty hooked up. Be interesting to see. Obviously camber we haven't actually touched yet, so where we're going to go with that in terms of changes. If we go lower, which will give us a little bit better traction and braking performance, or whether we actually want to go higher, which may give us a little bit more corner and grip, but also whether we're also going to go for an asymmetrical setup, because there's a lot more left-handed corners than right-handed corners here at Long Beach. However, this turn 1 demands quite a bit of grip from the right-hand side of the car, so I don't want to lower the right-hand side in terms of camber too much to take away that grip going into turn 1. However, it may give us a little bit better contact patch. We shall have to double check the temperatures in a bit as well across the width of the tyre, and basically see where we are with that. I'll check those in a lap or two's time once the tyre pressures are basically up to their stable hot pressure. There's not really too much point in checking them now if the tyre pressures are still increasing, because it's not going to be truly representative of where we are in terms of that temperature spread. Well, one of the good things is reasonably consistent in terms of getting those mid to low 18s. I haven't actually gone any quicker yet. That's the rear of the car gone, and that's contact with the wall. I was just taking a little bit too much speed going into turn 1 there. So do another half a lap or so. We'll double check the tyre pressures, make sure that they're in the right ballpark. And what we'll actually do in the next batch of changes is sort out the dampers. Basically put them in their critical ranges for the suspension that we have at the moment. And then also take a quick look at the camber, and then I'll probably call it there for this video. As quite conscious of the fact that although I'm obviously trying to help you guys out, that the other guys who I actually race with in the league probably also watch the video as well, and I don't actually want to give them away the full setup that I actually settle on. It's more actually about showing you the actual process, making sure that you actually do the laps to actually test the car and the changes that you actually make. That's better. Slow it down more. Don't want to go too deep in the fountain. Very close to the wall again. Rear end of the car wanting to step out there. Right, so let's take a look at the tyre pressures. 0.02 difference on the four corners. So camber, front, left. It's about a difference of 5 degrees across the width of the tyre. So we probably could increase it a little bit there. It's generally what I tend to aim for, is between 5 to 10 degrees across the width of the tyre. And we've got 6 degrees difference on the front right. Rear left is about an 8 degrees difference, so it could possibly drop that a little bit. And then rear left is 10 or so degrees difference, but we'll take a look how that actually works coming into turn 1 this time. Ooh, oh, caught the fountain there. Yeah, so that goes up to... So I think the rear tyres are actually pretty good. They're kind of in and around 7 or 8 degrees difference once we go through some turns that actually work them. So camber, what I might actually do this time is increase it up to 3.8. We'll leave the default. Leave the rears as they were default. Pretty happy there. It'll just be a case of sorting out the dampers, and for that we'll use UC's suspension calculator. So this is basically his calculator here. At the top, obviously, we've got the BMW M6 GT3 car selected, because that's the car that we're using. When you select that, make sure you hit reset, and it'll put everything back to its default values for the car. Now, the weight distribution, basically the green fields, if you click on those, it'll bring down the drop down, and that will basically allow you to adjust to the various clicks. The actual numbers that are represented in the basically the cream color are the values that you'll see in game. So with the weight distribution, the default for it is 2 in the green box. Putting it to 3 obviously matches in game, where it's 51% to the rear. With the springs, the default values are 8 and 4. Obviously, where I've gone 1 click lower on the spring rates, obviously pop those down to 7 and 3. Same logic applies again with the anti-roll bars, where it was 8 and 4, it's now 7 and 3. And then when it comes to the actual dampers, basically following what UC gives us targets to aim for, with regards to basically the slow bump, the fast bump, slow rebound and fast rebound, and then the actual front roll and damping, front roll damping and the heave damping, and then the critical values, and actually making sure that you get the red line kind of roughly in and around the 2 blue lines. Generally what you should be aiming for. Basically getting those critical ratios right, in and around the correct ballpark. These are basically the figures that I've come up with for the dampers using this calculator here. If you just follow what UC actually explains in the in that first post, I'll provide a link to the post on the official forums where you can get the suspension calculator. If you just follow his guide on there, and then basically have a little bit of a fiddle around and find the values. Obviously, input the values that you're using for your spring rates, and then also the anti-roll bar, and obviously start adjusting the dampers and aiming to get those in the right ballpark. So these are the values that I'll be actually using, and as you can see, I've gone and put those all in game here. So we're now going to save this as our next iteration, so V4. Obviously, important to reiterate again now, do your changes, make individual changes, save it, go out and test. I'm still, as you can tell, doing stuff in bulk to try and speed the whole process of creating a setup a little bit quicker, and have a pretty good idea of what I'm actually aiming for as well. So doing those individual changes will give you a much better idea as to how those changes have impacted the car in terms of handling. But now that I've got the dampers actually matching the suspension changes that I had previously made in the previous bulk of changes, the car should be a little bit better, especially over the bumps in that corner there that we just came out of, and likewise coming out of, I believe, turn 8 it is. So this is 7, and turn 8 is this one here where there's that nasty bump on the inside. Obviously the car is moving around a little bit because it's still got cold tyres and cold brakes, so they're not up to temperature yet, don't quite have the grip, which is why you're getting why I was getting the oversteer in the previous corners. But once these are up to temperature, things should be a lot better in terms of performance and handling. So again, like the previous runs, this next lap is going to be non-representative of the changes that we've made, as things are still coming up to temperature. Obviously we made changes to the camber as well. So that's another thing to bear in mind. So already near enough a second down on our fastest lap on this one, but I don't have anywhere near as much grip from the tyres just yet as that flying lap, so not even going to be close. It's probably going to be over 2 seconds by the time I actually finish the lap. But hopefully in another lap or two's time we should be able to push and actually see where we are in terms of performance with these last bulk of changes that we've just made. So whilst we actually wait for this to come up, a couple of other things to actually discuss. Obviously, oh god, royally messed up that corner. When it comes to time trial, I didn't quite get the wheel spin that I wanted to fling the car around. This traction control still on. When it comes to obviously time trial, you can afford to run things very, very low in terms of brake ducts and a radiator opening, wings, just to try and get that little bit more speed out of it. Obviously corners, the way it demands downforce, you will probably be beneficial to actually run some downforce rather than very low wing angles. I'm running very little downforce. Things are still coming up to temperature. When it comes to setups for wet races, generally what people tend to do is slap on a lot of downforce just to try and get that stability there, which works, but also downforce is less effective in the wet than it is in the dry, so bear that in mind, as you could actually see that it might actually be beneficial to actually keep some lower wing angles in the wet. Obviously sacrifice some of that stability in the medium and high speed corners, but you'll get a lot less drag, or a lot less unnecessary drag coming from that, so it's a bit of a trade-off there. Also, when it actually comes to the actual balance of the car with a wet setup, generally what people tend to go with is a safe understeery car, whereas actually having a little bit of oversteer actually helps to rotate the car into the corners a little bit better, and that can be a little bit quicker. Obviously you don't want so much oversteer that you're having to constantly fight the rear upon corner entry and going through the corner, so be wary of that. Obviously you want good traction, and obviously you want to adjust and lower the cambers to basically make sure that you're maximizing the contact patch going through the turns, because you'll find that you'll generate less G-force as there's less grip in the wet, so you can run those lower camber angles. So let's see how we go here with these. Confidence has been knocked a tiny little bit going into turn 1, so I'm not really pushing too hard going into there, trying to play it a little bit more safe. I'm trying to attack it a little bit more this time round. Make sure we get the car slowed down before turning in. Get the car slowed down for the fountain. Hooking up quite nicely through there. If we can hook up this lap, this could be down into the high 17. A little bit of oversteer there upon power. It's going to be close. I'm really going to have to push through this final sector. Ideally not that hard. The rear end was getting a little bit loose coming out the exit of the corner, and obviously went the other way a little bit. It was a little bit slow coming off the final turn there as well. So on the run to the line, we are very, very close to our fastest lap. Lifted the inside a little bit. Just got the car into a very slight slide. Into the corner using the full width of the track. Very close to the wall. A little bit more stable this time. You can see with the track I'm able to look through the corner a lot more than I can with the standard cams. Again, another lap time, very, very close. So consistency is there now with the setup. Also generally my driving as well. That's a good run through the fountain. Stuffed it in that corner. Contact with the wall, that's going to cost me a 10th. Or 2. And too deep there. Completely missed the apex. Just about able to hold onto the car, and that's just gone away and chucked another 3/10 out just with that little mistake there. Yeah, almost half a second down. And coming across the line. So that's 30 or so laps. Done a testing, taking a look at the tyre pressures, pretty much in and around the right sort of ballpark, all there together. There's a big oversteer moment there coming into that first turn. So I'm going to need to settle the rear a little bit going into that corner. What I might need to do is actually put a click of rear downforce on. The other alternative is to try and soften up the rear of the car a little bit more. The front feels good. reasonably good turning. It's just the rear end of the car is a little bit loose. It's not too bad. And when I actually look at the tyre temperatures down on the Motec display, there's no overheating from any of the tyres down there, which is good. Talk about those when I come onto this straight here. So chucking the car in, driving out. So yeah, the fronts are in the 80s, the rears are in the 90s. The rear left is the hottest there, and actually looking at the spread, they seem reasonably good. In terms of temperature spread from the inside third to the outer third on all the tyres. So I'm reasonably happy with the camber. What I might do is try running lower camber, see if that works. The only other adjustments that I can really think of are playing around with the suspension a little bit more. But generally the car's taking the bumps quite well. The other thing is obviously testing other downforce settings and going with those. But that is probably going to conclude it for this session. You should be able to, from this, get a good idea as to how to go about actually creating a setup and testing the various things. Like I said, been saying throughout this episode, is don't follow my exact process here of making bulk edits to the tuning setup. Adjust individual things one at a time. So do just spring rates, save to change, test them, then make just adjustments to the anti-roll bars, save them, do some testing, just a few laps, obviously adjust the dampers, test them with a few laps, same with camber. Make those adjustments one at a time rather than doing bulk edits. I was only doing it to try and make this episode a little bit quicker than it needs to be, rather than using the entire 2 hours. And also just to, I know, kind of have a better understanding as to what I'm actually doing with the adjustments of the car. So if we actually sit here, I'll show you what I actually mean with the tyre pressures now actually increase, because there's no cooling coming into the brakes, so the brakes are staying reasonably hot, and you can see that the tyre pressures are starting to increase. If I actually start driving again, the tyre pressures will actually come back down. But yeah, that's going to conclude it for this episode. I'll give you one final rundown of basically what I've settled on at the moment. The other changes that I'll probably end up testing and making basically beyond this in secret. I don't want to give away the actual setup that I will be using coming on the race, because obviously the episode should be released on the Tuesday when you guys get it, and then the race is actually on the Wednesday evening, so the day after. So there's an opportunity there for some of my fellow league competitors to actually get an idea as to what I've been doing and the direction that I've gone with my setup. So the things that we adjusted, we've left the tyre compound as they are. They're running on a hard tyre. The track temperature doesn't get low enough to actually go with the soft tyre. If it dropped down to between 25 to 30 degrees C, it could be worth considering possibly checking out the soft tyre, but where it's up in the mid 30s, it's too hot for the soft tyre. So hard tyre is going to be the one that I'll be using for qualifying, and then also the race. Obviously the tyre pressures, going to adjust those, aiming for that target of just under 1.80 bar, so around 1.78, 1.79 was generally what I was aiming for. Brake pressure I haven't touched. Brake balance haven't touched from the baseline. Might adjust the brake pressure a little bit later on after this episode. Duts I can't really touch. They're pretty much locked in terms of braking performance. All I really need to do is actually do a couple of long runs, so 10 to 20 laps, and basically get an idea as to what the brake temperatures are actually going to be like once they've they've stabilized at a more core temperature. Downforce at the moment I've got 2.5. I'll probably try a lower downforce setting of possibly 1.5. If that doesn't really work, then I may have to go one click higher on the rear downforce just to try and settle the rear a little bit. I could try playing with the longitudinal weight bias, could possibly shift it forwards a little bit, back to 50-50 rather than the 49-51, but it feels reasonably good there. Cursor angle we haven't touched, probably won't touch it, don't really ever do. Camber angle, upped a little bit. May try dropping those back down a little bit, just see what kind of performance in terms of lap time I get out of there. Ride heights I haven't changed. Ride heights are very rarely changed on the M6 GT3. They're pretty much bang on where I want them, really. There's not really, there's a tiny little bit of bottoming out around here at Long Beach, but there's nothing really that is detrimental to the handling of the car, and I like how it sits generally. Spring rate we obviously lowered a little bit, could possibly lower a little bit further, could stiffen it back up again. Not really too sure yet. Steering ratio I haven't touched. I might drop that down a little bit and make the steering a little bit quicker. I might go down to basically a 14.0 to 1 ratio. Toe-in angle obviously we've lowered down to 0.2, which will give us a little bit more responsive front end. Anti-roll bars we've softened up a little bit more to try and get a little bit more mechanical grip. The rear toe-in angle we've dropped from 0.4 down to 0.2 in the change of the baseline itself. I haven't actually touched it here in this session. Probably won't touch it, I'll probably leave it there. May go a click lower, don't really know. And then those settings there are the same as the ones here on the left. Obviously dampers, the bump stop we took out in the baseline setup, and the dampers we've adjusted with UC suspension calculator to match the suspension settings that we have gone with. Obviously if I go and make suspension changes, then I'll need to revisit the dampers here and potentially adjust these. I might do a little bit of finer tuning with these as well, just a little bit of tweaking and fiddling here just to see if I could get a little bit more stability and a little bit more performance in one or two corners to improve that lap time. When it comes to the ECU, engine and gearing, obviously the fuel load, I need to actually work out the actual average fuel load, and if I actually keep the camera here, I shall highlight where I can actually work that out. You can see the previous fuel load was 1.88 on the Motec display, actually behind, sorry, if you actually look on the Motec display on the dash inside the car, up the top there, I've actually got the fuel load that I've used on the previous lap, although I didn't do a full lap on the previous lap, so that's why I stand at 1.88. We jump back to the pits, but the average fuel lap, or the average amount of fuel that I'm using per lap at the moment is 2.13. So basically from that I'll be able to calculate how much fuel I'm going to be using for the race, go and chuck that into the car for the actual race setup. When it comes to actual qualifying, generally I tend to stick to the race setup and just drop that fuel load back down to basically give me 5 or 6 laps on a qualifying run. So that'll be somewhere between the region of 14 to 20 litres of fuel. That's basically generally how much I take out in qualifying. Other people tend to do qualifying in a slightly different way. They tend to put as little fuel in as possible to only do 1 or 2 flying laps. I'm not a great qualifier. I can't really bang out a really quick 1 lap wonder. I kind of have to build up a little bit more to it and basically give myself a little bit more fuel, and then basically do somewhere between 3 to 6 laps basically in a qualifying run to try and get a decent lap time. Boost pressure, not going to touch 100%. Obviously I'll get a little bit of engine wear running at 100% over the course of the hour long race, but it's probably only going to go up to 2 or 3 depending on how I attack the downshifts. Air restrictor, not going to adjust because I can't go any higher. Likewise with boost pressure, I can't go any higher. If I go lower, I'm only going to slow myself down. Radiator opening, pretty much locked in at 75%. Running it down at 70 could possibly do, but it's going to be a little bit risky. So I'll probably end up actually upping that for the actual race itself. Engine braking at 4 feels pretty good. That is something that I could possibly pump up to 5 and help with a little bit of stability when coming into turn 1. Obviously gear ratios can't touch. These are probably won't touch. Traction control there. The traction control slip may up a tiny little bit, but generally coming out of 95% of the corners around here, the traction control is not actually kicking in. It's only turn 8 with that nasty bump is where I can hear the traction control kicking in. Differential may play around with the preload a little bit, either go higher or lower. Clutches generally tend to leave at 4. The power RAM feels pretty good at 55, although it might go back up to 60, as that may help a little bit with basically settling down the rear end oversteer. Coast RAM feels pretty good at 25. Don't really need to change it, and I'm not going to use any of the other diff settings. So that is basically a rundown of the setup that I have so far. It's not going to be the final product, like I said, but hopefully this episode has given you a good idea as to basically how to go about tuning a car and making various setup changes. So hopefully you have stuck around for the full length of the episode. I know it's been quite long, over an hour, so I kind of apologise for that, but it should give you a good idea as to what you need to do in order to actually find a setup and basically gain a good 2 to 3 seconds from the very first initial few laps of testing on either a default or a baseline setup, and then working through to actually finding a setup and then actually getting the track knowledge. Once I've actually got a setup that I'm happy with, I'll lock that in, chuck in the fuel amount that I need, and then just turn as many laps as I can afford to do before the actual race, and basically just get to know the setup and get to know the track. You'll probably find another 10th or so getting that familiarization and getting just a little bit more speed out of that. So that is generally how I basically work. So if you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave those down in the comment section below. I'll try and get back to you as soon as I possibly can. But otherwise, thank you very much for watching the episode, guys. Please, obviously, if you've enjoyed the content, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Give the video a thumbs up, share it with other friends and fellow racers. But other than that, hopefully I shall see you in the next episode. Thank you very much for watching, and in the meantime, take care.